HDMI, DVI, USB. That's a lot of different cables, but what do they all actually connect to and what are they for? Find out more next.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
It's amazing how many devices do connect to our computer systems today to actually enhance the capabilities of our computers. But the one thing that has never changed and seems to continually grow is the amount of cables that we have to deal with. And of course, well, Wes is going to help us to sort through all those. Because Wes, one of the things that's really kind of frustrating, right, is to go, I know exactly what cable I need and not actually have it right there. So actually being able to identify these things is going to help. So where are we going to start?
Sure. So this is going to be one of those episodes where we're going to talk about some of the technologies. There are a lot of specifications that if you're going to set a certification exam that you're going to have under your belt. So we're going to talk about some of the specifications and we're going to talk about some of the key attributes between peripheral and video display cables.
All right, there seems to be a whole bunch of cables over there on the bench, so let's head on over.
All right, everyone, come on over here and join me. And those of you that are following along at home know that we're certainly not shy of any kind of standard specifications or cables when it comes to computing systems. And we're going to tackle some of the variety of connectors that we have today. And we're going to talk about, let's go ahead, and what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about some of the peripheral cables that we can use. And when I mean peripherals, to kind of distinguish it between that and video cables, because technically you can think about a monitor as peripheral to your system unit, but those are focused specifically. I'm going to talk about some of the video cabling standards that are associated with those. So let's talk about a tried and true oldie but goodie. And that's something known as the Universal Serial Bus, or USB for short. This is a long time standard. This standard has gone through many revisions. And by the way, out there, everybody, we put some, well, a lot of bit of the specifications and standards in the learner resources in the show notes. So I would encourage you to take the time to make flashcards, get these under your belts. If you're in a certification endeavor, if you are in a support endeavor, then it's still going to be important to know some of the specifications so that if somebody comes to you and they ask for support, that you can make the right decisions in which USB cable type to give them. All right, so what's great about USB? USB, it's a serial bus communication, and the ports that we connect to on our machines, on our devices, they typically provide 5 volts of power. And believe it or not, you can connect over 120 devices to a single USB port, doing what we call daisy chaining it to different hubs. But why would you do that? Well, you probably wouldn't do that in reality, because it would cause a lot of contention. You might see the performance drastically decrease if you're putting all of those devices on a single port, but you do have the capabilities, and that's something that we also have to talk about, right? There's a variety of standards out there, going all the way back to the earlier days where we had, like, for instance, 1.1. Now, 1.1 is kind of considered legacy today because it was only a 12 megabit transfer speed. 2.0, USB 2.0 specifically, that was kind of an industry standard for a good long time, and that was 480 megabit transfer speeds. And then we have a variety of versions. Now, I will tell you that when we got into USB 3.0, the special interest group, or USB forums that oversees this, they really had a major debacle, personal opinion, when it comes to the naming standards, because we had 3.0. And then 3.1 came out, and we no longer were calling 3.0 stuff 3.0. And then 3.2 came out, and now we're not calling anything 3.0 at all anymore. So I just want to let you know that when 3.0 first came out, it was a 5 gigabit transfer speed. However, there are revisions. You'll hear 3.1 out there. You'll hear 3.2 today. We have USB all the way up to USB 4 that has a potential for 40 gigabit transfer speeds on a USB port. Now, some of the individual specifications we'll leave in the show notes for you. I have some of the terminology and the designations. You will see today that they will talk about things like, for instance, USB Gen 2. You'll hear, or 3.2 Gen 1, or you'll hear something like 3.2 Gen 1 times 2. What do they mean when they say all of these different designations? But they're telling you how many lanes that they're adding, if you will, to that communication pathway, thereby a lot of times doubling what the overall throughput is. So those are a little bit about the specifications. I would get those under your belt. Another thing I would be able to identify is the various and variety of connectors that we have associated with USB. So Ronnie, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to take a trip back. We're going to get on our DeLorean here and we're going to take a trip back in time here. And we're going to go to probably one of the most recognizable standards that's still used today. And this is what's known as the Type A connector. That Type A connector has long been an industry standard and is still used pretty heavily today in today's industry. I'll also tell you that we have the traditional Type B connector. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll tell you out there, they used to call this a printer port. Be very careful. It's used for a lot of other things. In fact, all of our directors out behind the scenes will let you know that these are used in things like soundboards today. They're used to also transmit video to touchscreen monitors. So it has a lot of other uses, but technically I want you to know that's a Type B connector. So this is probably one of the, for a long time was the two of the most prevalent connectors, but then form factors, right, the size, the shape, characteristics of the ports, they started to get smaller. And you have what's known as a USB. This is what's known as a USB mini port. That's not as common today. It's still used. In fact, I use it in some lighting situations that I have LED light strips that actually use this. But that's your mini port. One that we are using primarily for things like drives. Let me go ahead and let me talk about, or not drives, excuse me, I'm sorry. Power ports, right, for things like mobile devices. This is what is known as a micro USB connector, and I know it's a little hard to see. Let's see if we can get that in the camera there. You can see the form factor there. Very, very small. If we compare it side by side to what's known as the mini, you can see kind of what the difference is. So the micro USB connector is also something that I would be aware of. Now, as the standard progressed, the Type B connector would change, the micro USB connector would change a little bit. You might see something like this, and this is on storage devices today as well. That's also a USB connector. That was one that came out as a result of the USB 3.0 standard today. Now, probably becoming more and more prevalent in the USB standard, and a port and connector I absolutely love is this one right here, and this is what's known as the USB-C connector. And the USB-C connector, you can see, is a reversible connector. If anybody's having to get over under a desk and bump their head a couple of times trying to figure out which way you should put in a USB connector, and you probably know quite literally, it can be a pain. But that's the Type C connector. And that's what we're going to see that USB is going to be moving to, and has moved in some of the later standards where, for instance, if you're going to do a or a USB 3.2 Gen 2 connection, it's required to use a USB-C standard. Now, the other thing I want to mention just briefly with the USB standard, if you haven't heard of, is this USB-PD. I know you have enough acronyms when it comes to technologies, but that is called power delivery. And one of the great things about USB since 3.0 and then later generations is the fact that we can bring more power than the traditional 5 volts that USB brought. So if you see that, just be aware of what that means. That means that that connector can bring power to a device as well. These are some of the things that, Ronnie, I would be able to identify if you're going into a certification exam and a support endeavor and some of those specifications. Don't forget your flashcards.
Yeah, as a real world kind of, I don't want to say warning, but a notification to you, remember that all USB cables are not made the same. And the reason why I want to point that out is if you see a good deal on USB cables, like an insanely good deal, I would be careful about saying I'm going to trust those to actually power these devices which I rely on, because you do not know what the specific or what they're actually following and making that cable out of internally. I've seen USB cables that somebody said, hey, you know, they got such a great deal on it, but they really couldn't get any real connectivity out of it. We cut it open and it was barely like 2 or 3 wires that literally were on the inside of this cable. So be careful with cables if you buy them. If you're putting them into a system that you're going to depend on, go for the better cable, follow the standard that's out there, because if not, you're going to really end up finding out that you can burn that cable out You name it, there's some other things that may happen.
Ronnie, and let me piggyback on that, especially when you talk about power delivery and
Yeah,
power-enabled
definitely.
cables. That's probably one of the best admonishments you're going to hear when it comes to USB. Do not shortchange yourself in the cable quality, because chances are you can permanently ruin the devices, the peripheral, and even the motherboard if you happen to have connected directly to a motherboard within a system unit. Now, there's another connection out there that I want you to be aware of that also allows us to do peripheral-based connections, and it's a technology that really is side by side with USB today, and that's one of these type of cables right here. That's what's known as a Thunderbolt cable. Now, I want you, for the exam, those of you that are in a certification exam, I want you to look at this. This is a Thunderbolt cable, and I want you to see the form factor. But I also want you to see a form factor of another cable that we're going to talk about, and that's something known as DisplayPort. Please understand that while the Thunderbolt cable uses the same form factor as a mini DisplayPort cable, which we'll come back to, the DisplayPort cable, they are not one and the same, and you have to be aware of that. Now, Thunderbolt is a great technology. It offers a lot of bandwidth. You have 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. We're talking about, like, for instance, in 2.0, the fact that you could get, and kind of give you an era when these came out. 2013 MacBooks had the 2.0 implementation, and you can get 20 gigabit speeds, which is absolutely just astronomical. You can see things in Thunderbolt 3.0 specifications that you can get 40 gigabit transfer speeds, and you can actually power 2 4K displays. Yeah. Right, you can send out resolutions that are just mind-boggling today too. So know a little bit about that Thunderbolt connection and some of the specifications. And again, we put these in the learner notes. I don't expect everyone to have this in their memory just by watching this episode once. Take your time, make your flashcards, get these under your belt so that if you're sitting that certification exam, regardless of the scenario they throw at you, you're going to be able to identify the right answer.
Yeah, now with these cables, I want to put another, I hate to say warning because people go, oh no, don't do that. But these cables, once we get in Thunderbolt, Wes, these can be super expensive. A comparative length of regular USB-C cables to a Thunderbolt cable, I mean, in that length of 6 feet or whatever it might be, it can be 2 or 3 times more expensive with these cables. And you might not think that that's any real big deal, but it also means you have to treat them a little bit more carefully too. So when you see people swinging the cable around as they walk down the hall, if that's a Thunderbolt cable, they may be breaking stuff inside, and that cable may not function as effectively as you think. So you want to handle these types of cables, I'd say any cable overall, right? With some respect, not as being used as a lasso to lasso somebody as they're running down the hall, but you want to handle these because they will become expensive if you don't treat them properly too.
Yeah, give you an example, Ronnie. I said, because I love technology here, and I love hardware, and I don't mind every once in a while treating myself to a piece of technology that I probably could have waited a year or two before allow the price to come down. But an external USB hard drive, or drive, if you will, I've seen a couple terabytes, and it's less than $100. I've seen one that's 500 gigs and it's Thunderbolt and it's about $400. So you talk about that price difference, and especially that cable, they are considerably more expensive, at least at this point. We're recording this in the beginning of 2022. So you'll see that for the most part, the prices are still very expensive today. So that takes care of our peripheral components. Now we've got to talk a little bit about some of the video display cables, if you will. These are the cables that we plug into the back of our PCs, if you will, and we run them to our external monitors. And there's a variety of technologies. There's one that's been around for a very long time, and you're probably wondering, why are we even talking about that in this day and age? And that's this one right here. That's what is known as a VGA connector. VGA is a long-time standard, and to kind of show you what the connectors look like here, they're what are known as DB15 connectors, because they're 15 pins D-shaped connectors. So if you ever see the DB15 designation, know that that's also code, a little bit of technical jargon, if you will, for your certification endeavors, for a VGA connector in the way that it's shaped. Now, when we talk about VGA, again, acronym city here, let's help you out with some of the alphabet soup. We're talking about Video Graphics Array. And the Video Graphics Array goes back to the earlier days of computing, really just coming out of monochrome. So it has been around for a very long time. Max resolution on VGA would have been 640. Hold up now. Some very good technology here, 640 by 480. But you might ask yourself, Wes, why are we talking about a technology that's so legacy today? Because it is still heavily supported on your commodity level hardware that you will see in enterprise level machines when they deploy them out 1,000 at a time. There's still a VGA port on there, and that's because of the fact that they are a cheaper connection. So that's one of the more legacy ones today. But as time progressed, we went away from these analog type signals, and what we wanted was a full digital signal. And that's where we get into the next one, where we have what is known as the digital video or digital visual interface, DVI as it's called. So DVI, a couple different terms when we say DVI. You could see digital visual interface or digital video interface. Visual interface is the more common term today. And let's take a look at a connector. There's a series of connectors for these, and these are nice because they have a series of pins, and then they've got a blade connector that we could see to the left-hand side of your screen right there. And depending on the connection type will dictate how the pins are arranged. Now, I will tell you that you will even find, and Ronnie can back me up on this one, that we've seen sometimes where manufacturers will even just abandon a specification. They'll have a DVI connector that you won't even be able to find unless you go right to that vendor. So we're not worried about those, but there are three types that I want you to be aware of for this exam. Keep in mind that this is a digital signal that we're sending down the cable. It's not digital audio, but it is digital video. All right, and there's three variations. There's what's known as DVI-A, DVI-D, and DVI-I. When we talked about DVI-A, that was an analog-only signal, and that was kind of bridging that gap between the earlier VGA connections that were available and the newer DVI standard that was coming out. Then there was DVI-D, and DVI-D is digital only, right? So you can remember that for the certification exam. But then there's also the integrated, the DVI-I, and that would support both analog and digital video. So a couple of different standards that I would be aware of, and then some of the types of connectors that we've mentioned with the various digital video interface or DVI-based standards. Now that paved the way for probably one of the most common technologies that we even have today, and that's what's known as HDMI. Give you everybody a look at what the connector looks like. I would be able to associate the 19-pin connector that we see here, and yes, sometimes pins matter on a certification exam, and I can't tell you that they don't. But this is a 19-pin connector. This is the high-definition multimedia interface, and this HDMI connector was the very first cable and connection type that we could send digital video and digital audio across, all in a single cable. Now, as the standard progressed, and I've got a slew of standards here, there are different category cables. Do not confuse these with network cables, but the different category standards that they have, you don't only get just digital audio and video anymore. You'll see that you can get standard cables that also have Ethernet capabilities too. And I've put the different classes of cables and some of their capabilities. Like for instance, we have high-speed cables category 2. That's 1080p at 4000K. Not 4000K, 4K. That's a lot of Ks, right? 4K resolution, right? Can scale up very, very large. But then you have the category 3 cables that can pump an entire 18 gigabits per second across that cable, supporting things like, for instance, 4K resolution, and even some of the category 3 cables here that we have for HDMI that support 8K resolution. And again, it's a variety of standards. I don't expect you to have all of this under your belt and be able to sit a certification exam after the end of this video. Take the learner notes, make you some flashcards so that if they end up asking you questions about these, what is an all-digital video and audio interface that we can use through a single cable, HDMI is going to be the right answer. But Ronnie, the problem with HDMI, at least a problem from the industry goes, is that it's a proprietary technology that requires a certain amount of licensing from the company that invented it in order to put it within your systems. So There's a consortium out there, and you'll hear this if you get into working with displays and working with monitors, and it's called VESA. That is the Video Electronic Standards Association. And what they said is, hey, you know what? We want a royalty-free digital video and digital audio interface, right? And that brings up our final one that I want to briefly talk about here, and that's called DisplayPort. Now, DisplayPort has a few different types of connectors. Let me show you the full-size connector. And what I'd really like to do, Ronnie, so we can kind of see compare it back to the HDMI, because you never know if you're in a certification exam if they might have a variety of pictures here. All right, so what we have here, this is the HDMI connector, right? And then we have the DisplayPort connector. And if we look at the DisplayPort connector, you can see that it has kind of like a blade shape. It looks a lot like our serial ATA data cables inside of our systems today. That is what is known as the full-size DisplayPort, bear with me, port, if you will, connector. And I want to show you that in comparison to what's known as the mini DisplayPort connector. Right, mini DisplayPort is the same form factor for Thunderbolt, but just please keep in mind that they are two different signaling protocols, even though the form factor of the connection itself is the same. Electrically, they are not the same protocol, and that is something that is important on the exam, and I want you to be aware of. DisplayPort is an all-digital video and audio signal as well, much like HDMI. The big difference here is it is a industry-wide non-proprietary standard that doesn't require royalties in order to manufacture it and implement it via some computer manufacturer. And you have what's known as HBR standards, high bit rate, version 2, version 3, if you will, all the way up to what's known as ultra high bit rate, where we can see 8K resolutions at 60 hertz. Remember that when we talk about a hertz on a monitor, it's how fast the screen is refreshed. The faster the screen refresh, the less motion blur you get. So that is something that might be telltale if you are making suggestions as to which DisplayPort standard should we be implementing. So a variety of cables that we use for our peripheral components as well as our video components. We've got the learner notes. Some of it, I have to tell you, I know is not always the glorious work of flashcards to get those specifications under your belt. We've also shown you what they look like, and I would be able to identify them whether you're sitting a certification exam or you're in a support role, so that if you have to make a suggestion to your end users, you're going to make the right one.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.